Hello and welcome again to another exciting edition of Synoptic Gospels online with Life Pacific University. Today we're going to be talking about historical Jesus, which may sound kind of strange. Essentially what this is what do we know about Jesus as a historical character? Okay. And what we have here in this image on the left, we have what's referred to as the Ponte crater icon, which is at a monastery in Sinai. It's a very famous icon because you can kind of split the picture of Jesus in half, and the left side looks a little bit different than the right side. And this is intended to reflect sort of the dual nature of Christ. And so what I've done with it is I've sort of superimposed this other image on top of it on the right side here. And this is a recent historical reconstruction of what Jesus may have actually looked like. Now, I don't know the process that they went through to try to reconstruct that, but I thought that was interesting, and I thought sort of juxtaposing this kind of idealistic icon of Jesus with sort of this historical guess at what Jesus would have looked like kind of gets at what we're trying to do in historical Jesus. We believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God of true God, true light of true light, as the Creed says. But we also want to look at him historically and try to see, what can we know about him as a historical person? What sort of details can we get about him from that? There are several quests, so-called quests, for the historical Jesus. And this doesn't mean that prior to this first quest that no one thought about Jesus historically. This means that from an academic perspective, the first concerted attempt to try to understand Jesus through the lens of history begins in the 1700s. Okay, so in the 1700s up to the early 1900s, this approach is an attempt to destroy orthodox views of Jesus and produce a Jesus that's more acceptable to the modern European mind. So this is sort of like an Enlightenment thing. And one of my friends will get mad at me because he doesn't like it when people throw out the word Enlightenment, because it is a diverse and complicated thing in and of itself, and that's true. But this aligns somewhat with the caricature of the Enlightenment. Okay, and so that's what this is. First Quest portrayed Jesus as God conscious, not God man, and spiritual but not religious. And Rudolf Bultmann famously said, "What we know about the historical Jesus could fit on a 4x6 index card." Okay, and so this is what we know about Jesus historically. This quest was essentially brought to an end by Albert Schweitzer's devastating critique that demonstrated these questers all found a Jesus who looked suspiciously like themselves. To work off of Mark Twain. Mark Twain says that God created man in his own image, and man, being a gentleman, returned the favor. That this is essentially what they are doing. And by the way, much of this material I'm getting from the New Testament and Its World by N.T. Wright and Michael Bird, and so that's where I'm deriving a lot of this information. So. And then we get something that we refer to as the no quest period. So after the first quest, there is a period of no quest where people sort of withdraw from the historical pursuit of Jesus. So this is where Karl Barth is very significant. And this is Karl Barth, not Karl Barth. That's how you pronounce his name. And so two significant figures who supported this abandonment by claiming that the early church was interested only in the Christ of faith, not the Jesus of history, were Rudolf Bultmann and Karl Barth. And this is sort of the dichotomy that gets thrown out a lot in historical Jesus, which is the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And that's kind of what I'm playing with the image, right? Is that we have the Jesus of history, the reconstruction, and then we have the Christ of faith. It's sort of that duality there. The second quest for the historical Jesus was launched when Ernst Käsemann rejected his teacher Rudolf Bultmann's assertion of the irrelevance of the historical Jesus in the 1953 lecture. And the second quest was skeptical of the Gospels and relied on a set of scholarly tools that were not particularly well designed for the task. For instance, the criterion of double dissimilarity, and we don't need to get into the weeds on that. The second quest was temporarily revived in the late 1980s by a well-publicized group called the Jesus Seminar that attempted to reconstruct Jesus by voting on the authenticity of the materials in the Gospels. And for some of you who are older, you may remember the Jesus Seminar. For those of you who are younger, you've probably never heard of them, and that's not a bad thing. I'm not opposed to skeptics who are doing historical Jesus research. I'm not trying to get into that, but the historical Jesus, the Jesus Seminar people, some of that's laughable. And so, if you've never heard of the Jesus Seminar, you're not in a bad place there. There are some scholars in there that know what they're doing. But a lot of the people in there, I mean, there's like a journalist in there and some other people like that just don't know what they're doing. So, the third quest begins with the work of Ben F. Meyer and E.P. Sanders in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The focus of the third quest was to situate Jesus in terms of first century Judaism and set his message within Jewish eschatological hopes for the long-awaited national restoration of Israel. And this is kind of where we're at now. This is what we're doing with historical Jesus. We're trying to understand him in the context that he was in first century Palestine. So, where we're at with this third quest, you've got Bart Ehrman with things like Misquoting Jesus, How Jesus Became God, Lost Scriptures, Lost Christianities. Ehrman is an atheist that teaches at UNC Chapel Hill, and a really good scholar. But I mean, he's going to come from a very different perspective than an evangelical would. And so definitely worth reading his work. He's definitely a strong voice to listen to. I really appreciate a lot of what he has to say. I'll obviously also disagree with him quite a bit on several things. But for instance, he wrote an entire book about how Jesus was a real historical person, and there are people out there that debate whether Jesus even existed. Now, it's worth noting that no actual scholar debates whether or not Jesus existed, apart from, I forget his name. There's one guy that debates Jesus' existence that actually has a PhD in history. I can't remember his name. But that's it. Everybody else in the discipline accepts Jesus as a real historical character. John Dominic Crossan is one of the scholars in the Jesus Seminar that I mentioned that knows what he's talking about. So he's got a book called The Historical Jesus, which is huge. I've got it. It's a big honking book, like 800, 900 pages. So worth checking out. Larry Hurtado unfortunately passed away recently, and he was an evangelical, and so he's got some solid books. And his blog, by the way, if you just Google his blog, if you're not into getting into a whole book, you can just read some of his blog posts. His blog's phenomenal, and he taught at university in the UK for the longest time, and then unfortunately died of cancer a few years ago. Gary Habermas, Mike Locono, both of them have written several things separately. Also, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus is sort of their popular level approach to this topic. Then Craig Keener. Keener is the author of the Bible Background Commentary in the New Testament that you're using in this course. Keener is just a machine, just cranks out so much work in so many different fields. It's just astounding. And so Keener's Historical Jesus of the Gospels, also just a huge book. He actually has more endnote, index, and works cited in the book than he does content in the book. It's just astounding the amount of work that's put into that. And then Michael Bird, or the one who is to come, and then also the Gospel of the Lord, how the early church wrote the story of Jesus. Dr. Bird is my PhD supervisor, so I strongly encourage you to read anything that he writes. Not just because he's my PhD supervisor, but I chose him as my PhD supervisor because I love his scholarship so much. Really appreciate what he has to do with evangelical theology, with historical Jesus, with commentaries on books in the Bible. He's just another machine that just cranks out so much information. Just wrote a book on religious freedom I mean, the guy's just, he's crazy. And so, again, follow his blog, follow his podcast, and just well worth your time, Michael Bird. So these are some of the sources you can check out if you're interested in this topic. The main person that we're going to be in conversation with here is going to be Ehrman. He's the biggest voice on this topic, especially in the secular world. So Nicholas Perrin of Wheaton, another good scholar who's an evangelical, and Wheaton is actually one of the schools Ehrman attended before he became an atheist. Perrin cautions us that there are really only three responses to Ehrman's work, especially on the historical Jesus. We can concede the force of his arguments, we can offer a counter to his arguments, or we can ignore the whole thing and hope it goes away. Now, I understand at this point that you might be thinking, all of this historical stuff, like, why does this matter for ministry? Well, look, you're going to have somebody in your congregation, you're going to have somebody who is a friend of someone in your congregation who is going to read Misquoting Jesus by Ehrman, and they're going to raise objections to the faith. This is a pastoral concern. Not because, they shouldn't be reading Ehrman, but people need to be equipped to dialogue with things like that. And so rather than conceding the force of his arguments or ignoring the whole thing and hoping it goes away, we need to do the work and offer counter to his arguments. And a lot of the scholars that I just mentioned have done that. Ehrman wrote how Jesus became God, and a lot of evangelicals, including Dr. Berg, my supervisor, wrote how God became Jesus in response to it. And it's phenomenal, right? And so these are the things that we should engage with. So I'm going to give you kind of just a snapshot of some of the things that you can think through in response to this stuff if someone in your church runs into this. Obviously, this one lecture is not going to be sufficient for you to completely counter everything that Ehrman might say, but hopefully it'll give you enough of a taste that you'll know where to go from here. Okay. So what we first want to start with is, what do we need for historical knowledge? Well, if you read Keener says, we lack historical evidence for most of what has happened in history, and yet no one claims that nothing happened except what we can demonstrate by historical standards. Okay, so we have to start thinking through, like, what do we mean by proving something historically? Like, how do we know something happened historically? So Habermas and Lacona give us 5 principles of determining whether or not something happened historically. They say we need multiple independent sources and support. We need an attestation by an enemy, embarrassing admissions, eyewitness testimony, and early testimony. Obviously, we don't need all of those in order to have historical knowledge, but these are the kinds of things that we want to look for in determining whether or not we have a good historical basis to know something. Okay, so when we're looking at Jesus and we're trying to establish these things, what should we use? Should we use Christian sources? Should we use secular sources? Should we use Gnostic or heretical sources? Well, the answer to this is we should use every source we can get our hands on, because everything offers us a glimpse at history. Right? Whether it's secular, heretical, whatever, everything is giving us data, and that data is helpful. Okay, and so for instance, Habermas says that we have 17 secular sources that tell us about Jesus within 150 years of his life. Now, this is going to be important just for the purpose of this lecture. Remember, 17 and 150 years. 17, 150 years. Okay, so 150 years, 1869 was about 150 years ago. What should we believe regarding the Civil War? Can we trust northern sources? Can we trust southern sources? Can we know anything at all about the Civil War? I have books that are older than 150 years. And so I have sources that are actually older than that on my shelf over there. And so obviously, we can know things from 150 years ago. Let's look at what we have in history. Let's look at, Alexander the Great. Habermas is where I'm getting this information. Habermas does a really great job with this kind of stuff. So Alexander the Great dies around 330 BCE. Plenty of contemporaries wrote about him. We don't have any of those contemporary sources. What we do have is a source 300 years after he dies. Our best sources aren't even that. They're Plutarch and Arrian, and those sources wrote 400 to 450 years after he died. So Alexander, one of the most important historical figures of all time, and we don't have good data about him until hundreds of years later. Right? So this is sharp contrast with what do we have for Jesus. Again, Habermas told us we have 17 sources within 150 years. With Alexander here, we have an early source, we have Plutarch, and we have Arrian within 450 years of his life. And we have a few others in there too, but they don't tell us much. So what else do we have? Let's go to Tiberius. Tiberius is Roman emperor during the time of Jesus. 4 major sources inform us about his life. We have a contemporary source, a Roman general. It's early, but it doesn't tell us much. We have Tacitus, writes almost about 100 years after Tiberius. We have Suetonius, writes about 100 years after Tiberius. And we have Dio Cassius, who writes in the 3rd century. This is a Roman emperor, and the first significant information we learn about him is 100 years after him. Right? And so again, in contrast to Jesus, 150 years, 17 sources. Okay, this is a big deal. So what do these 17 sources tell us about Jesus? They tell us over 60 things. 60 things about Jesus. 12 mention his death. Ehrman will even tell us that the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion in the 1st century is an unassailable historical fact. Okay. 6 of these mention him as deity. Now, what we have to be careful with here is just because we find a source that mentions him as deity, it doesn't prove that he's divine. All it tells us is that there are people who thought that. Okay, so these are secular sources that are talking about Jesus as divine. That doesn't mean they believe he was divine, and that doesn't prove for us that he's divine, historically speaking. What it proves for us is that there are people in that time period who would have said that sort of thing, which historically speaking, that's important information. Pliny the Younger, 112 CE, writes to the Emperor Trajan. And in this letter, he mentions that Christians gather each week and sing hymns to Christ as to a god. So this is less than 100 years from the crucifixion. And we have people gathering on a Sunday, and they're singing hymns to Christ as to a god. He further verifies that those who are truly Christians refuse to revere the Roman gods or the emperor. They also refuse to curse Jesus. All this is under threat of death. So it's really fascinating to have someone who distinguishes between true Christians and false Christians. So this is really fascinating. We actually have Trajan writing back to Pliny, because Pliny's asking, should I kill these people? And Trajan writes back and says, obviously you've got to persecute them, but don't go out of your way to do it. Just persecute them if you run into them, right? And if you can't avoid it, persecute them. This is sort of like the elevator pitch, right? If you only have a couple of minutes, Jesus dies by a crucifixion, unassailable fact. Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and that he appeared to them. Church persecutor Paul suddenly changed. Skeptic James, brother of Jesus, suddenly changed. And then the empty tomb. Now, if we have those facts, we can be very confident of the resurrection. Those 5 facts, and we can establish those historically as facts, give us a very reasonable case, historically speaking. It's what's called abductive reasoning or inference to the best explanation. What best explains these 5 historical facts? The best explanation of these 5 historical facts is the resurrection of Jesus. There is no legitimate alternative to these 5 facts. To that explanation of these 5 facts. And really, there isn't anything. So, let's take another look, though, at something else, okay? So, historical Jesus, well, let's kind of look at historical Jesus through Paul. So, historical Paul, sort of. Virtually everybody concedes his existence and his training as a Pharisee under Gamaliel. Gamaliel is a grandson of Hillel, and Hillel is one of the most important rabbis in the history of Judaism. New Testament includes 12 books by him, 6 to 7 of which are broadly accepted. There's some books by Paul that are rejected as authentic. One of the ones that is broadly accepted is 1 Corinthians. And in chapter 15, he says, I gave to you that which I was given. And so when we say, I gave to you that which I was given, what does that mean? Now, for those of you who are visual learners, let's take a look at it this way, okay? And here's some specific passages in Galatians that kind of help us date things. So we know Gallio in Acts 18 is only in Corinth for a year. This is when he gives that which he receives. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. This is when he received. And so we know that Paul is in Corinth in 51 because of Gallio. We know that Paul probably writes it around 57 CE. We know Paul verifies with Jerusalem in around 37 because this is our 14-year gap, right? And after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him for 15 days. Paul meets with Jerusalem in 34. So this is our 14-year gap and our 3-year gap. And our crucifixion, 30 CE, maybe 33 CE. So we're within, at the very most, 4 years of the crucifixion. So not only do we have the minimal facts, but we have this thing in 1 Corinthians 15, which tells us Jesus died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried, and then he was raised according to the Scriptures. And that thing that Paul says he receives it in 34 CE. When he meets with Cephas, or Peter, in Jerusalem, he's making sure that his gospel is accurate, right? And he meets with him, and then he confirms with him again in 37 CE in Jerusalem. His conversion very, very possibly is 31 CE. We can know this with reasonable certainty, and we can know that this message of Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, was buried, and was raised according to the Scriptures, that message exists within 5 years of the cross. This is not enough time for there to be some sort of like mythos to develop. It just isn't. If someone died 5 years ago and you tried to persuade us today that person is God and that they raised from the dead, you're not going to have a very good time. It's not going to work for you, right? There's lots of us in living memory that can tell you that isn't the case, right? But that isn't what happens, right? We don't have any, no one shows us a tomb with Jesus's body in it. No one fact checks them, right? There's, this is very solid historical evidence. Again, inference to the best explanation. What's the best explanation of the data? The best explanation of the data is that Jesus indeed rose from the dead. So that's what we mean by historical Jesus. We don't mean necessarily this, dry, boring academic exercise. We mean something that actually matters. Pastorally, actually matters. Your faith is not just this faith that, is based on feeling or based on experience. Your faith is anchored in the person of Jesus. Author of Hebrews says that he's the anchor of our hope behind the veil. Your hope is anchored in the person of Jesus, and that person of Jesus is a real historical character. And we know with reasonable historical certainty, inference to the best explanation, again, that Jesus died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and then he was raised according to the Scriptures. Because nothing else reasonably explains the change in the disciples, the change in Paul, the change in James. Nothing else reasonably explains these things. This is the best explanation of the data. And so, for me personally, this is something that I rehearse when I'm struggling with doubt. This is something that I go back to when I'm having a bad day. There are days where I'm not fond of Christianity. there are days when it's not easy, right? I'm sure you have those days too. And on those days, I remind myself, even if I don't like it, this is the best explanation of the data. God exists. Jesus was real. Jesus died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried according to the Scriptures. He was raised according to the Scriptures. and we can know that with reasonable historical certainty. So, Father, I pray that you would, for us, cement in us the reality, or not just this like hypothetical, ethereal idea, but the concrete, tangible reality. Lord, John says in 1 John, what we have seen, what we have touched. That God, you are not a distant deity, but you are one who makes yourself tangible. And that in making yourself tangible, you are giving us evidence that when we have bad days, we can remember that you have shown up. That just like with the Israelites making altars, when you've shown up, that we would make altars in our lives. That, Lord, even this lecture, even this information would be an altar in our life. That if we encounter doubt, if we struggle, that we could be reminded that Lord, you are the best explanation of the data. Your resurrection, your activity on our behalf is not only an article of faith, but it is a historical fact. Thank you for that, Lord.